To think you know Henry VIII is to fall for one of history's most carefully polished illusions. The portrait that lingers in the popular imagination is simple. The king with 6 wives, the founder of the Church of England, the stern face framed by a beard and a jeweled cap, glowering from oil paintings in London's galleries. Schoolbooks reduce him to a crude tally: divorced, beheaded, died; divorced, beheaded, survived. But step closer, and that carefully managed image begins to rot, just as his body once did. Beneath the veneer of royal majesty was a man who became more grotesque, more tyrannical, and more terrifying than any schoolroom rhyme could ever suggest. Henry VIII was not merely a king of marriages or a man of politics. He was a creature of contradictions. Once an athletic prince who dazzled Europe with his jousting and music, later transformed into a monstrous figure who could barely move without mechanical assistance. By the end of his life, he was no longer just feared. He was loathed, a sovereign whose very presence repelled his own attendants. The myths of divine right and noble lineage could not disguise the reality. Henry's reign was a descent into paranoia, cruelty, and decay so profound it reads more like a Gothic tragedy than a chronicle of kings. Imagine a monarch so physically ruined that his servants recoiled from the stench of his body, so swollen with disease that his own coffin could not contain him. Imagine a man whose paranoia became so feverish that entire networks of spies were tasked to watch one another, feeding an endless cycle of suspicion. The great palaces of England were transformed into cages of fear, where a stray word or careless glance could end in a death warrant sealed with royal wax. And yet, this is the same Henry who charmed ambassadors in his youth with his wit and music, who composed love songs and boasted of his knightly valor. How could such a figure become the horror of Europe? Was it illness, or destiny, or simply the corrosive effect of unchecked power? Historians argue, but the evidence is clear. The king who once embodied Tudor glory ended his life as something far darker. This story is not one of simple cruelty or gluttony. It is the story of a man whose own body betrayed him as spectacularly as he betrayed wives, servants, and subjects. A king who demanded the obedience of a god, but whose final years revealed him as nothing more than flesh rotting on a throne. The Tudor dynasty, so celebrated for its drama, found in Henry a ruler who blurred the line between man and monster. And so, we begin not with the polished portraits that hang in gilded halls, but with the hidden truths, the secrets that courtiers whispered in terror, the horrors that could not be committed to official records. What you are about to hear will make the bloody intrigues of Game of Thrones sound like a child's fairy tale. For Henry VIII's life was no mere reign. It was a slow, grotesque unraveling of a king who believed himself untouchable, even as disease, paranoia, and cruelty consumed him. By the twilight of his reign, Henry VIII's body had become his greatest enemy. What once had been the frame of a vigorous young prince, broad-shouldered, strong-armed, a man who excelled at jousts and dances, had swollen into a grotesque parody of kingship. His waistline stretched to an astonishing 54 inches. To put this in perspective, the average Tudor man weighed little more than 140 pounds, yet Henry tipped the scales at nearly 400. In an age when food itself was a sign of privilege, his sheer size should have symbolized wealth and abundance. Instead, it symbolized ruin. But weight alone does not explain the horror. Henry's legs were ravaged by ulcers, festering, open wounds that never healed, that seeped pus and oozed the stench of rotting flesh. These were no minor injuries. Chronic infections ate into his body so deeply that attendants gagged when required to approach him. Eyewitnesses reported the odor clung to the very rooms of the palace. Courtiers held perfumed handkerchiefs to their noses just to survive his presence. For those closest to the throne, tending to the king's body was not service. It was punishment. Servants drew lots, dreading the day they might be ordered to dress him, for that meant kneeling near sores that looked like something from the battlefield, rather than a royal chamber. It was as if the king himself had become a walking corpse, alive only in title. He could not mount his horse, could not climb stairs without mechanical aid, and could scarcely walk across a room without collapsing into his specially designed chairs. These contraptions, built with pulleys and wheels, were not merely practical. They were symbols of humiliation, reminders that the once vigorous monarch now required machinery to play the role of king. In Tudor England, the body of the monarch was not just his own, it was the body politic, the fleshly representation of the kingdom itself. Chroniclers often described rulers in almost sacred terms, their physical health mirroring the prosperity of the nation. By this logic, Henry's suppurating wounds and grotesque figure were more than personal afflictions. They were omens, signs that England itself was festering under his rule. One wonders if the nobles whispered in private that the king's failing body foretold a failing kingdom. Medical science at the time was steeped in the theory of humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. An imbalance of these, it was believed, caused sickness. Physicians lanced and drained Henry's wounds again and again, believing they were restoring balance, but in truth, they made his ulcers worse, inviting further infection. The royal surgeons could do little more than apply ointments of honey and herbs, desperate measures that masked the smell but never cured the rot. And yet, none dared speak of decline in direct terms, for to admit the king was failing was treason itself. Imagine the atmosphere of those royal chambers, the reek of decay mingling with incense, the sight of perfumed courtiers flinching as they bowed. This was not majesty, it was horror wrapped in velvet and gold. Henry VIII had become a spectacle of his own mortality, a sovereign whose very flesh betrayed the illusion of divine power. The true turning point in Henry VIII's transformation from golden prince to monstrous tyrant came not from politics, but from a brutal accident in January 1536. On the tilt yard at Greenwich Palace, Henry, then 44 years old, charged into a joust, armored and confident as ever. But in an instant, the majesty of the spectacle collapsed into chaos. A horse crashed down on him, pinning him beneath its weight. The king did not rise. For 2 long hours, Henry lay unconscious, unresponsive, and to those watching, very nearly dead. In the 16th century, such an accident was often fatal. Even surviving it came with a cost. Modern medical historians suggest Henry suffered what today we would recognize as a severe traumatic brain injury. It was not merely a blow to the head, it was the reshaping of a man's mind. From that day forward, those around him began to notice disturbing changes. Where once there had been charm, wit, and a certain reckless vitality, there now emerged paranoia, cruelty, and violent mood swings. This pattern is all too familiar in history. Julius Caesar, after a head injury, is thought to have suffered seizures that altered his judgment. The French King Charles VI, known later as Charles the Mad, descended into delusion after a sudden collapse. In Henry's case, the accident seemed to rip away the last vestiges of restraint. He became unpredictable, merciful one moment, merciless the next. Courtiers who once relied on his favor learned that a single glance, a wrong word, could shift the king's mood like a storm breaking over calm seas. The jousting accident also reopened an old leg wound, which never healed properly. This wound became the source of the ulcers that plagued him for the rest of his life, feeding both his physical agony and his temper. Chronic pain, untreated and unrelenting, can turn even gentle souls bitter. For a king who already bore the weight of dynastic anxiety, political treachery, and the heavy myth of divine right, pain became fuel for tyranny. Accounts from after 1536 describe a Henry who was no longer simply demanding, but terrifying. He lashed out at friends, executed counselors on suspicion, and treated his wives with escalating brutality. To his subjects, it was as if the joust had awakened a demon within their king. Perhaps the people whispered that God had struck him down that day, that his survival was not a miracle, but a curse. What is certain is this: the man who entered the lists at Greenwich was not the same man who rose, battered and broken. The crown still glittered, the pageantry still unfolded, but behind it all, Henry VIII had crossed an invisible line. From prince to tyrant, from king to monster, his reign took on a darker tone, one that would haunt England for generations. If the jousting accident marked the moment Henry's mind began to unravel, disease ensured his body followed the same path. Physicians of our own age, studying his symptoms across the pages of chronicles, suspect he suffered from Cushing's syndrome, a condition caused by hormonal imbalance. It explains much: the rapid weight gain, the mood swings that bordered on madness, and above all, the stubborn ulcers that refused to heal. To live in the 16th century was to live with illness as a constant companion, but few illnesses dared to touch the sovereign, at least not openly. For Henry, disease became both visible and humiliating. He could barely control his bowels in his final years. Royal attendants were forced to carry special chairs lined with cloths, trailing after him from chamber to chamber, prepared for sudden accidents. Imagine the indignity. A king who declared himself head of the Church of England, the living symbol of divine authority, reduced to being shadowed by servants with makeshift toilets. Yet not a single physician dared speak plainly. To question the king's health was to question his right to rule, and that was treason. So they flattered him, promised recovery, and whispered excuses when his body betrayed him. Courtiers went further still, describing him in public as vigorous, even while gagging in private from the stench of his wounds. It was a theater of denial, played for the survival of those trapped in his orbit. The Tudor idea of monarchy did not allow for a sick king. The king's body was, in theory, perfect, anointed by God, infused with sacred authority. But Henry's flesh mocked this belief at every turn. His ulcers burst through bandages, his belly strained against his doublets, his face swelled so that portraits had to be subtly flattered by painters who feared the truth. The contradiction was unbearable, the image of divine kingship rotting in plain sight. This contradiction fed Henry's paranoia. If his body could betray him, who else might? If God's chosen king could suffer like a common man, what did that mean for the myth of Tudor invincibility? He clung all the more desperately to power, demanding obedience, even as his own body slipped beyond his control. And in this desperation lay cruelty. He turned his humiliation into rage, lashing out at wives, nobles, and even his own children, as though punishing them might silence the truth of his decay. Thus, disease was not merely a private misery for Henry VIII. It was the engine that drove his tyranny. Every ulcer, every failure of his body, deepened his fear that he was losing control. And in seeking to master that fear, he inflicted horrors on all who lived beneath his crown. Life at Henry's court became a study in fear, not only fear of the king's temper, but fear of his very presence. To serve him closely was no honor, it was a punishment. The attendants chosen to dress him, to lift him into his chair, or to bind the bandages around his ulcerated legs often did so with dread in their hearts. They drew straws for the task, like men gambling their lives, for one careless wince or a gesture of disgust could mean dismissal, imprisonment, or worse. Imagine kneeling before him, the silks and jewels of his robes masking a body that leaked foulness, the air heavy with incense to conceal the odor. The courtiers forced smiles, murmured praises, bowed deeply, yet inside their stomachs churned. No one dared turn away. The Tudor court was a theater, and Henry was both director and executioner. To falter in the performance was to risk everything. But beyond the stench and spectacle, there was something deeper, an erosion of humanity itself. Servants learned to see the king not as a man, but as a force of danger, like a storm or a wildfire. The fear was not only of punishment, it was of contagion, of proximity to decay. One ambassador noted that Henry's wounds were so grotesque that people recoiled as if death itself clung to him. To touch him, even in service, was to brush against mortality. And yet, courtiers had no choice but to orbit him. In Tudor England, proximity to the king meant survival. Land, wealth, titles, all were distributed by his hand. To flee him was treason. To displease him was death. So men and women of noble blood, educated in manners and politics, reduced themselves to sycophants, choking on perfumed cloths while they praised the man they privately dreaded. This contradiction, adoration masking loathing, gave the court a feverish quality. It was a place where every word was weighed, every smile rehearsed, every movement calculated. Even silence could be dangerous. To fail to cheer loudly enough at his appearance, to look away when his ulcers seeped through his hose, could be taken as an insult. The palace halls were not filled with music and joy, but with the quiet terror of those who knew their fates hung on the moods of a suffering tyrant. In this way, Henry's body became more than a personal prison. It infected the entire court, turning Westminster and Hampton Court into gilded cages of fear. The king's flesh was failing, but his power still held. And so, courtiers lived in a grotesque paradox, chained to a man they despised, compelled to worship the monster their king had become. When most people think of Henry VIII, they think of his 6 wives, names repeated like a grim nursery rhyme: divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. But those words hide the reality, smoothing over the terror these women endured. They were not wives in the modern sense, nor companions in love. They were pawns, political tokens, sacrificial offerings to Henry's insatiable hunger for power, heirs, and control. To marry Henry was to step onto a stage where survival itself became uncertain, where every gesture, every whisper, every rumor could mean the difference between a crown and a scaffold. In Tudor England, queenship was not a sanctuary. These women were expected to embody purity, loyalty, and obedience, while also navigating the treacherous politics of court factions. They were both symbols and scapegoats, held responsible for Henry's happiness, his lineage, even his moods. Divorce was almost unthinkable in Christendom, yet Henry tore England from Rome itself in order to rid himself of Catherine of Aragon. After that, no wife was safe. Once a precedent had been set that a queen could be discarded, every queen after lived in the shadow of execution or annulment. To the outside world, these marriages were matters of alliance. Catherine of Aragon bound England to Spain. Anne of Cleves represented German ties. Jane Seymour soothed a wounded nobility by giving Henry a son. But behind the formalities lay horror. Catherine of Aragon spent her final years in isolation, forbidden to see her own daughter. Anne Boleyn, accused of treasonous adultery, was forced to watch innocent men die before she was led to the scaffold. Catherine Howard, scarcely more than a child, was executed for her past love affairs. Even the fortunate ones, Jane Seymour and Anne of Cleves, were not spared grief. Jane died from childbirth, her body broken by the very heir she delivered, while Anne was forced into a humiliating annulment she had no power to resist. Marriage to Henry was not the fulfillment of a royal dream. It was entrapment. The gilded halls became prisons, where queens walked as if on glass, never certain when affection might sour into suspicion. Gifts one day, accusations the next. A kiss in public followed by whispers of betrayal in private. Henry's wives lived under the shadow of a man whose moods swung with the violence of storms. And the cruelest truth, there was no escape. Running away meant treason. Refusing the king's hand meant death. Even submission did not guarantee survival. These women were trapped in a system where the will of one man could rewrite law, religion, and life itself. They were not merely Henry's wives. They were his captives, paraded before the world as queens, while privately enduring a terror most could scarcely imagine. If one wife embodies the nightmare of Henry's court, it is Anne Boleyn. She began as a dazzling figure, witty, ambitious, and unafraid to challenge convention. To Henry, she was not only alluring but intoxicating, a woman who dared to say no until she was promised a crown. Yet the very spark that captivated him would become the fire that consumed her. When Henry tired of her, he did not simply cast her aside. He orchestrated one of the most chilling frame-ups in royal history. Accusations were fabricated with surgical cruelty. Her own musician, Mark Smeaton, was tortured until he confessed to an affair with her, a confession that everyone knew was a lie. Worse still, Henry extended the charges to 5 men, including Anne's own brother, George Boleyn. They were accused of incest, treason, and adultery, charges so grotesque they shocked even seasoned courtiers. Anne was forced to watch as these men, innocent of any crime but loyalty to her, were executed. Imagine the terror of standing there, knowing you too were condemned, and witnessing your brother beheaded because your husband needed a pretext for your death. These were not random acts of cruelty. They were carefully staged performances, designed to humiliate Anne and remind the court that even a queen was disposable. Her trial was a mockery of justice. The evidence was flimsy, the witnesses coerced, but it did not matter. Henry had already decided the verdict. Anne was convicted and sentenced to death. Yet in one last twist of irony, Henry allowed her an unusual mercy: execution by a skilled swordsman imported from France, rather than the clumsy axe of the Tower. It was not compassion, it was theater. Henry wanted her death swift, spectacular, and memorable. What makes Anne's fall so haunting is not simply her execution, but the way her humanity was stripped from her in those final days. She was no longer wife, no longer queen, but a symbol to be crushed. The woman who had changed England forever, who had been at the heart of the break with Rome, who had given birth to Elizabeth, one of history's greatest monarchs, was reduced to a criminal on a scaffold, her dignity swallowed by Henry's paranoia. And yet, in her final speech, Anne displayed a courage that shamed her accusers. She praised the king, begged God to protect him, and accepted her fate without bitterness. It was the ultimate act of Tudor survival, dying with grace so her family might live. But the cruelty was complete. Henry, once infatuated, once willing to split Christendom for her, now dined and laughed as she was laid in an unmarked grave. Anne Boleyn's story is not just the tragedy of a queen. It is the proof that Henry VIII's love was a weapon, sharper than any sword, and that those who stood closest to him were always standing on the edge of death. If Anne Boleyn's fall was a spectacle of cunning and betrayal, Catherine Howard's fate was pure tragedy. Barely more than a child, when she caught Henry's eye, she was thrust into a world of power, lust, and danger far beyond her years. Catherine was likely no older than 16 or 17 when Henry, bloated, ulcer-ridden, and decades her senior, chose her as his bride. To the king, she was a glittering jewel, her youth a balm to his decaying body. To Catherine, the crown was less a gift than a sentence. From the beginning, whispers followed her. Catherine had grown up in the household of the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, where young girls mingled with tutors, musicians, and wardens in an atmosphere far looser than the rigid codes of court. There she experienced innocent flirtations, even a romance. None of it should have mattered. But when Henry's men uncovered these past relationships, they became weapons of destruction. Henry's reaction was not the rage of a betrayed husband, but the fury of a man obsessed with control. He declared her past a crime against him personally and against the monarchy itself. Parliament was pushed to pass a chilling new law. From that moment on, it was treason for a woman to marry the king without revealing her entire sexual history. Imagine the pettiness of such a decree, an entire legal system twisted into a monument to Henry's humiliation. Catherine was arrested, interrogated, and condemned. Unlike Anne Boleyn, she was scarcely seasoned enough to navigate the machinery of politics. She was young, terrified, and utterly powerless. Accounts say that when she learned of her execution, she wept uncontrollably and begged for mercy. But mercy was not in Henry's nature. On the morning of her death, Catherine reportedly asked for the executioner's block to be brought to her cell so she could practice laying her head upon it. A girl rehearsing her own death, an image so haunting it has lingered through centuries. When she walked to the scaffold in February 1542, she was no queenly figure draped in majesty, but a trembling teenager forced to die for a past she could never erase. Her final words begged forgiveness and prayed for Henry's health. And then, with one stroke, her brief, tragic life was ended. Catherine Howard's story reveals Henry at his most pitiless. It was not enough to control his wives in the present. He reached back into their pasts, punishing them for moments of humanity, rewriting law to destroy them. For Catherine, marriage to Henry VIII was not an elevation to glory. It was a death sentence signed the moment she accepted his ring. Long before Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard faced the axe, there was Catherine of Aragon, the first wife, the woman who wore the crown for over 2 decades, and the one who knew Henry when he was still young, vigorous, and full of promise. Daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, Catherine was royalty in her own right, a princess raised in the shadow of the Reconquista and educated to be both pious and formidable. When she married Henry, she must have imagined a future of stability, children, and shared rule. For years, she gave him precisely that: dignity at court, loyalty in politics, and genuine affection. But there was one thing she could not give him: a surviving son. Child after child died in infancy, and though she bore him a daughter, Mary, Henry's desperation for a male heir festered into obsession. The very bond that once tied them, love, respect, alliance, was broken on the anvil of dynastic anxiety. Catherine was not merely a wife who failed to satisfy a husband. She became a queen accused of failing England itself. Henry's solution was as brutal as it was unprecedented. He demanded an annulment, claiming their marriage had never been valid. Catherine, proud and unyielding, refused. She would not call her daughter a bastard, nor would she renounce her place as queen. What followed was a years-long struggle known to history as the King's Great Matter. It tore England from Rome, reshaped Europe's alliances, and ignited religious wars that would burn for generations. For Catherine herself, the cost was unbearable. Banished from court, she was sent into what was essentially house arrest. She was denied the comfort of her daughter Mary, the very child for whom she had fought so fiercely. Henry spread rumors that she was unstable, bitter, unfit. In reality, Catherine remained steadfast to the end, writing letters filled with dignity and devotion, even to the man who had destroyed her life. In one of her last, she addressed Henry not with venom, but with love, calling him her most dear lord and husband. He never read it. She died in 1536, alone, likely poisoned by illness, or perhaps, as some whispered, by design. She never saw her daughter again. Her burial was marked not with the honors of a queen, but with the trappings of a dowager, her title stripped by the very man she once supported. Catherine of Aragon's story is not only personal tragedy, it was a political earthquake. Her treatment outraged Spain and the Catholic powers of Europe. To many, she was the rightful queen, and Henry the usurper of his own marriage vows. In humiliating Catherine, Henry humiliated himself in the eyes of Christendom. And yet, she bore her suffering with a grace that made her seem, in the end, more royal than the king himself. Between the doomed stories of Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, and Catherine Howard, two wives stand apart: Jane Seymour, remembered as the one Henry truly loved, and Anne of Cleves, the woman who survived by surrendering everything but her pride. Yet even their fates reveal the same pattern. To marry Henry was to step into a perilous game where chance alone decided whether you left the stage alive. Jane Seymour was gentle, modest, and cautious, qualities Henry craved after the firestorm of Anne Boleyn. She soothed his court and promised what he wanted most: a son. In 1537, she delivered Edward, the male heir that secured the Tudor line. For that, Henry showered her with affection, calling her his true wife. Yet this victory came at a terrible price. Jane died just 12 days after Edward's birth, her body broken by the ordeal of childbirth. For once, Henry had not tired of his wife. Death had claimed her first. Still, even his grief carried a chilling coldness. Within days of her funeral, courtiers whispered of his plans to remarry. Mourning did not slow the machinery of politics, nor the hunger of a king who always wanted more. Then came Anne of Cleves, chosen not for love but for diplomacy. England sought alliance with the German states against Catholic Europe, and Anne, sister of a powerful duke, seemed the perfect bride. But when she arrived in England, Henry recoiled. Portraits painted by Holbein had flattered her, and Henry, spoiled by control, found her appearance unworthy of his throne. He mocked her in private, calling her a Flanders mare, though she was neither unattractive nor unrefined by the standards of her time. The insult revealed more about Henry's vanity than about Anne herself. What followed could have ended in another scaffold, but Anne proved shrewder than most gave her credit for. When Henry demanded an annulment, she did not resist. She signed away her crown, acknowledging the marriage was never consummated, and in return received a generous settlement, estates, and the title of the king's beloved sister. By bending, she survived. Unlike her predecessors, Anne escaped with her head still on her shoulders, and even remained in England, occasionally appearing at court as though nothing had happened. Yet survival was not without humiliation. To go from queen to sister was a reminder that her fate had been in Henry's hands from beginning to end. Still, in a reign littered with corpses, Anne of Cleves achieved something extraordinary. She endured Henry's wrath and lived. Together, Jane and Anne embodied two sides of the Tudor nightmare. Jane, the ideal wife who fulfilled her duty, perished from the very act that gave her value. Anne, the discarded pawn, survived only by effacing herself. Both reveal the truth. In Henry's world, queenship was not power, it was peril. By the time Henry had cycled through Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour, Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, and Catherine Parr, one truth had become unavoidable. Marriage to the King of England was not a covenant, not a partnership, not even a gamble. It was a death trap disguised in lace and jewels. The very institution of matrimony, sacred to Christendom, blessed at the altar, was twisted into a weapon by Henry's hand. What made it so terrifying was the absolute lack of escape. In a world where annulment was a legal rarity, Henry turned it into a tool of convenience. If a queen displeased him, she was forced to sign humiliating documents declaring her own marriage invalid. Imagine the cruelty of being compelled to erase your life with ink, to declare before God and all of England that your love had never existed, only because the king demanded it. For Anne of Cleves, survival meant agreeing she had never been Henry's true wife at all, thanking him for granting her freedom. Gratitude became the mask worn over humiliation. For others, there was no annulment, only execution. Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard were beheaded. Catherine of Aragon was discarded and left to die alone. And yet, even in death, Henry controlled the script. He decided whether a queen would be remembered with dignity or with shame, whether her children would be branded legitimate or bastard. In effect, Henry's wives became legal hostages of the crown. They were bound by vows they could not refuse, and yet those vows could be shattered at Henry's whim. The law bent and twisted around his desires, transforming marriage into a performance staged for power, not love. Compared with other European courts, this was unprecedented. In France, kings had mistresses, yes, but their queens were rarely humiliated so publicly. In Spain, royal marriages were rigidly bound by Catholic law. Even unhappy unions endured for the sake of diplomacy. Henry alone made the intimate politics of the bedroom a national crisis, reshaping law, religion, and family around his moods. To be a Queen of England in Henry's time was to live under constant trial. Each woman walked into her marriage knowing that obedience would not save her, that loyalty could still end in death, and that love, if it ever truly existed, was irrelevant. Marriage was not sanctuary. It was a noose. If Henry's marriages revealed his cruelty, his dining table revealed his gluttony. By the end of his reign, his appetite had become as legendary and as grotesque as his tyranny. He consumed food not merely to survive, nor even for pleasure, but as if eating itself were a performance of power. Historians estimate Henry devoured nearly 5,000 calories a day, more than double what an active man requires, and far beyond what his sedentary, disease-ridden body could endure. A typical meal included whole roasted pigs, multiple chickens, piles of venison, endless loaves of bread, mounds of puddings, and oceans of ale and wine. He gorged himself on fish, especially on fasting days when church tradition forbade meat. But even then, he found ways to indulge, feasting on sturgeon, salmon, and lampreys fit for an emperor. The sheer logistics of feeding him were staggering. The royal kitchens at Hampton Court employed over 200 staff, preparing more than 800 dishes daily, not just for Henry, but for the courtly machine that surrounded him. Yet the king himself sampled dozens of these, treating his meals like a parade of abundance. Entire forests of deer were culled, rivers scoured for fish, and farms drained of poultry just to sustain his table. For the average peasant scraping by on bread, pottage, and ale, the contrast was obscene. And still, quantity was not the strangest part. It was ritual. Henry's meals unfolded like theater. Every dish had to be tested first by food tasters, men who risked their lives with every bite in case of poison. But Henry's paranoia pushed this to excess. He often required them to wait 30 minutes after tasting, ensuring no slow-acting toxin would fell them. Only then would he raise the food to his own lips. Thus, dining could stretch for hours, a spectacle in which the king ate under the eyes of his courtiers, each bite both a triumph and a test of survival. Imagine the scene. A banquet hall filled with noblemen watching in silence as their monarch, massive and ulcer-ridden, tore through meat with greasy hands, gulping down wine while musicians played to mask the sound of his labored breathing. For the courtiers, it was not a meal. It was a sermon in gluttony, a reminder that the king's appetite could consume not only food, but fortunes, lives, and even the realm itself. What makes it even more haunting is that Henry's doctors surely knew his diet was killing him. Medieval medicine could not explain cholesterol or heart disease, but it could recognize imbalance. Too much red meat, too much sugar, too much ale. These were signs of excess, condemned even by moralists of the time. Yet no one dared advise moderation. To suggest restraint to Henry VIII was to risk being labeled a traitor. And so the feasts continued day after day as the king ate himself into decay. For Henry VIII, food was never just sustenance. It was magic, symbolism, and obsession. He believed certain dishes carried powers that could shape his body and even his destiny. In his mind, to eat a swan was to inherit its grace, to devour venison was to strengthen his prowess as a hunter, and to gorge on oysters was to fuel his virility in the royal bedchamber. The table was not merely a place of appetite, but of ritual, as though the act of consumption could mold the king into the godlike figure he imagined himself to be. This was not unusual for the age. Medieval Europe was rife with superstitions about food. Physicians trained in the Galenic tradition advised that foods were hot, cold, moist, or dry, each altering the humors of the body. Garlic was said to inflame lust, almonds to sharpen the mind, wine to balance melancholy. But where others treated these as guidelines, Henry clung to them with the desperation of a man whose failing health begged for miracles. His table became a laboratory of superstition, a place where diet promised salvation. Yet even as he indulged, Henry sought to distance himself from the common folk. Certain foods, turnips, barley, coarse bread, were banned from his court, not because they harmed him, but because they symbolized poverty. He would not lower himself to eat what peasants ate, even though such foods might have saved him from obesity and disease. Instead, he drowned in sugar-drenched confections, roasted meats, and exotic imports like citrus and spices, flaunting his wealth with every bite. In the Tudor imagination, abundance equaled majesty. But in Henry's case, abundance became decay. Every meal unfolded like a pageant. Dishes were paraded in with trumpets and fanfare, each covered in ornate lids engraved with Tudor roses. Courtiers watched as servants unveiled peacocks cooked and redressed in their feathers, gilded pies hiding whole birds inside, and sugared sculptures so elaborate they resembled works of art. These spectacles were not meant to nourish, but to awe. For Henry, food was theater, proof that he alone, among all men in England, could command such abundance. But beneath the glittering surface lay paranoia. Even as he treated his meals as magic, he feared poison in every dish. Spices were tested, wine decanted in guarded chambers, loaves broken open before his eyes. He demanded his kitchens be locked like fortresses, guarded by armed men. Each cook watched to ensure no treachery slipped into the pot. In the end, eating became not only performance, but war, an endless siege between appetite and fear. Thus, Henry's table reveals the contradictions of his reign. Superstition cloaked as medicine, gluttony paraded as majesty, paranoia disguised as caution. To sit at his feasts was to witness a man who sought salvation in swan's flesh and oysters, who believed he could devour health and power into his body, even as that very body betrayed him day after day. By his final years, Henry VIII's greatest prison was not his body, but his mind. He trusted no one, not his wives, not his counselors, not even his own children. Paranoia consumed him, warping his court into a place where suspicion was law and fear the only currency. At night, the king slept surrounded by weapons. Loaded crossbows leaned against the bedpost. Daggers lay hidden beneath his pillows. Armed guards stood inside his chamber, watching him breathe, their eyes trained on doors and shadows. Sleep itself became an act of danger, and Henry guarded it like a soldier in hostile territory. The palaces he once filled with music and revelry turned into fortresses of suspicion. He ordered the construction of secret passages and concealed stairways, not for romance or convenience, but for escape in case assassins came. Peepholes were carved into walls so that he could spy on his own courtiers. Rooms were rigged with crude listening devices, designed to capture whispers that might betray a plot. To walk the halls of Whitehall or Hampton Court was to wonder if the walls themselves had ears. Even this was not enough. Henry created a labyrinth of informants, spies tasked with reporting not only on nobles and diplomats, but on one another. The court became a nest of serpents, each man and woman glancing over their shoulder, uncertain who might carry their words back to the king. Trust dissolved. Friends betrayed friends, servants betrayed masters, all for the faint hope of royal favor, or simply to save their own necks. This atmosphere of terror echoed the worst courts of history. Like Nero in Rome or Ivan the Terrible in Russia, Henry built a surveillance state before the term existed. He wielded paranoia as a weapon, ensuring that no one felt safe, that every conversation might end on the scaffold. To live in his presence was to perform loyalty unceasingly, with every breath and every gesture, for one careless slip of the tongue could mean execution at dawn. What is most haunting is how ordinary life continued amidst this fear. Banquets were held, hunts organized, masks performed, all while daggers lurked in the dark and spies hid in the shadows. It was a court of glittering terror, where velvet and gold barely concealed the iron bars of suspicion. Henry VIII, once a golden prince admired across Europe, had become a fortress king, walled in by his own fears, barricaded against imagined enemies, and enslaved not by rebels or rivals, but by the ghosts of his own paranoia. If paranoia ruled Henry's nights, it haunted his days at the dining table most of all. Poison was his greatest terror, an invisible enemy that could slip past guards, bypass spies, and strike in silence with a single bite. And so, Henry turned every meal into a military campaign. The procedure was meticulous. Each dish destined for the royal table passed through layers of inspection. First, the raw ingredients, meat, fish, grain, even water, were examined and tested by different servants to ensure nothing had been tampered with. Then came the cooking, performed in kitchens sealed like fortresses, under the eyes of armed guards who monitored every movement of the cooks. Once the food was prepared, tasters sampled it, not once, but often twice. And still, Henry would not touch a bite until enough time had passed to prove the poison was not delayed in its effects. The theater of fear stretched into absurdity. Spices had to be measured and checked separately, as if even a pinch of saffron might conceal a deadly powder. Salt was guarded as carefully as gold, lest an enemy slip venom into it. Wine was poured from one vessel into another, each stage overseen by a different official, so that no single man could be blamed or trusted. By the time Henry raised a goblet to his lips, it had been watched, handled, and tasted by half a dozen trembling hands. And yet the king's suspicion never eased. He believed assassination lurked everywhere. Even his daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, mere children, were watched by spies, lest they conspire against him. Imagine the terror of living under such scrutiny, knowing your own father saw treachery in your play and betrayal in your prayers. This obsessive fear was not unique to Henry, but his excess made it grotesque. Many monarchs employed food tasters. Few turned kitchens into war zones. His banquets became less a celebration than a battle drill, every servant marching in lockstep against a phantom enemy. And all the while, Henry's own appetite betrayed him. He consumed enough food and drink each day to fell an ordinary man. It was not poison that was killing him, it was his own gluttony. Yet he never saw it that way. In his mind, he was too divine to be undone by meat and wine. No, the true threat had to come from others, from imagined assassins in shadows, from enemies at court, from the children in his own household. Thus, every feast became an act of war, every sip a test of loyalty, every crumb a weapon that might bring the king to ruin. Henry VIII did not merely eat. He staged his meals like sieges, paranoid rituals in which survival was never guaranteed. Paranoia did not stop at the edge of Henry's plate. It seeped into the very heart of justice, twisting law into nightmare. In his later years, men and women were executed not for deeds committed, but for deeds imagined. A rumor could kill, a dream could damn, and silence itself could be fatal. Henry grew convinced that betrayal was inevitable, that everyone around him, from courtiers to counselors, was plotting his downfall. When no evidence existed, he manufactured it. At times, he ordered arrests based on vague prophecies or on dreams recounted by others that cast him in danger. To Henry, suspicion itself was proof. If the thought existed, the crime was real. The Tower of London filled with victims of his imagination. Nobles, poets, musicians, priests, all found themselves behind its cold walls, accused of treason that often amounted to nothing more than a careless word. Some never faced trial. Their deaths were decided before they saw a courtroom. Others endured trials that were pure theater, where witnesses were coerced, juries bullied, and verdicts predetermined. The atmosphere at court grew unbearable. People learned to censor themselves with fanatic discipline. Jokes vanished, conversations shrank, laughter turned brittle. Friends avoided one another for fear of being accused of conspiracy. Even family ties offered no shield. Henry sent cousins, in-laws, and trusted advisors to their deaths, convinced that blood itself might breed rebellion. And the cruelest irony, those who informed against others often found themselves accused in turn. Spies were watched by spies, and betrayal became a daily currency. It was a court devouring itself, a cycle of fear where survival demanded silence, obedience, and a willingness to watch neighbors die. The executioner's axe fell with terrifying regularity, so much so that Londoners began to treat public beheadings as common spectacle. For the people of England, the sight of noble heads on Tower Hill was no longer shocking. It was routine, a grim reminder that their king ruled not by love or respect, but by terror. In this climate, it is no wonder that courtiers began to interpret Henry's very moods as omens of life and death. A frown at dinner, a pause in conversation, a muttered complaint, each could be fatal. The king had made his paranoia law, and law became nothing more than the shadow of his fear. By 1547, Henry VIII was no longer a man but a ruin. His body had swollen grotesquely, his legs wrapped in bandages that leaked pus and blood. He could not walk without being hoisted by contraptions of pulleys and chairs, his massive bulk carried from room to room like a burden no one wished to bear. Servants trailed behind him with cloths, gathering scraps of rotting flesh that fell from his body. The King of England, once the embodiment of youth and vigor, now left a trail of decay wherever he moved. The stench of his sickness permeated his chambers. Physicians tried to mask it with herbs and incense, but even the hardened men of medicine could not endure it long. Some sources claim that in his final days, his doctors fled his bedside, vomiting from the reek of infection. It was not the smell of a dying man, it was the smell of death itself, leaking out before its time. And yet, even at death's door, Henry clung to the illusion of power. He continued to issue commands, to plot alliances, to demand obeisance. Courtiers obeyed, though many surely wondered how long they would need to endure the nightmare. Few dared to speak openly of the king's decline. In Tudor England, to say the monarch was dying before he took his last breath was treason, and so they bowed before a corpse in waiting, pretending his words still carried the weight of God. When death finally came on January 28, 1547, it was not a peaceful release, but a grotesque collapse. His swollen body strained against its own skin, his breath rattled in agony, his face puffed and waxen. No solemn passing marked by dignity and silence. Rather, the end of Henry was as chaotic and disturbing as his life. And then came the rituals of royal death, which in Henry's case became rituals of horror. His massive frame had to be wrapped in lead sheets to contain it, the coffin specially reinforced to hold the weight. Still, the body bulged and swelled, gases building within as decomposition took hold. What should have been a solemn procession of England's most powerful king was already teetering on the edge of grotesque spectacle. Even in death, Henry VIII could not grant peace to his realm or to himself. His very corpse rebelled against dignity, becoming a final, dreadful symbol of the man who had ruled through fear, gluttony, and suspicion. Henry VIII's reign did not end cleanly with his last breath. It spilled outward, grotesque and uncontrollable, just as his life had been. During the funeral procession from London to Windsor Castle, his swollen corpse, sealed in layers of wood and lead, could not contain itself. The pressure of decomposition built until the coffin burst open. Royal remains seeped into the hearse, and attendants recoiled in horror. Chroniclers whispered that dogs licked the fluids that dripped onto the ground, a final humiliation for the man who had once styled himself as God's chosen ruler. Even his burial was chaos. The grave at St. George's Chapel, Windsor, had to be dug wider than normal, and the earth struggled to hold the sheer weight of his coffin. The tomb itself became a place of unease. For years, rumors spread that foul odors lingered in the chapel, that strange sounds echoed at night. Some swore it was Henry's ghost, restless for all eternity. Others suggested the simpler, more terrible truth. His bloated body had continued to rupture beneath the stones, releasing gases long after burial. In this grotesque ending lay a terrible irony. Henry, who had claimed divine right, who had reshaped England's religion and bent its laws to his will, could not even master his own corpse. His body, once paraded as the symbol of power, became a warning of mortality and corruption. He had sought to build a dynasty unassailable by man or God, yet in death he was reduced to little more than carrion, feeding stray dogs on the roadside. And yet, Henry's shadow did not vanish with his body. His actions had torn England from the Catholic Church, creating a fracture that shaped centuries of conflict. His paranoia had modeled tyranny for rulers to come. His treatment of women, of wives turned victims, cast a long shadow over the image of monarchy itself. To this day, the rhyme of his 6 wives lingers in classrooms, but the true horror of his reign lies not in verse, but in the raw fear, suffering, and decay he inflicted. Henry VIII is remembered as the king who could not be satisfied, not with 1 wife, nor with 6, not with food, nor with power, not with loyalty, nor with faith. In the end, he consumed everything, love, friendship, trust, even his own body, until nothing remained but rot. His story is not the tale of a glorious monarch, but a warning carved in flesh and stone, that unchecked power can turn a man into a monster, and even kings are not spared the decay of time.